All right. Looks like we're here. I always have a little delay, I think. So it is what it is. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about how to respond to those subtle verbal bullying behaviors that we talked about on Tuesday. And first off, I'm going to be the bearer of some very bad news, and that is that there is not like a strategy, a one size fit all strategy that's going to work in every situation that you're in, or for every subtle nonverbal bullying abuse that you're experiencing. There just isn't a one size fit all for, verbal subtle abuse. I know that's sad, but the reality is that you're being abused in a wide array of ways, and so therefore your strategies and responses also have to have a wide kind of spectrum. The other thing also is you have to have more than one strategy, and a lot of times what you do is actually use a ton of strategies for one type of verbal or bullying abuse, right? So you kind of layer on your strategies to intensify their ability to protect you from workplace bullying and to keep you professional and to get your point across, if that makes sense. So your strategies really are building blocks, and you can make it them and shape them and do different things with them. That's one of the things, I've written a book about strategies to deal with workplace bullies, and I talk about that idea of kind of layering up different strategies to make the impact of the strategy more effective. Okay, so there isn't a one size fit all. The other thing I think is really important when you're talking about strategies is that you do things that work for you, that that some things I'm not good at doing and I don't like to do, and not as a strategy they wouldn't be effective. So just because I'm going to talk about some strategies, if it makes you feel like it's like, eek, I don't want to do that, you don't have to do that, because there's plenty of other strategies that you can do. Okay, so of course, anytime you're picking a strategy, the one of the most important things that you can do is stay calm and collected. Right, so staying grounded. So it's really important that you have strategies to maintain yourself and stay grounded. And if I recommend that you have more than one grounding technique, because sometimes what is happening in that environment that you're in, that bully culture, you might have like a deep breathing grounding technique that you use, but you might blow through that just like this, and that's not working. So you have then another grounding technique that you can use. Okay, so I used to use several grounding techniques. I would do some deep breathing, in through my mouth, out through my nose. I think I've told you before, I made lists. I would take notes if it were in meetings. And, sometimes I would say the things in my head that I wanted to say that I knew I couldn't say, but I would be saying them in my head as they were responding to me, just as a way for me to sort of, especially if they were high tense emotional situations. And sometimes the reality is sometimes those grounding techniques just don't work. You know what? That happens when you're in a bully culture. So again, try to, when they're, criticizing you, using sarcasm, putting you down, interrupting, and the more you can stay calm, the better it is for you. So the first thing I want to talk about is one technique, and we talked about this I think last week, is using silence, right? I mean, ignoring some of those things and remaining silent can be very effective. Okay, so if somebody's interrupting you, the question you have to ask yourself is, do I want to engage in this, or do I not want to engage in this? Because sometimes what bullies do, and aggressors and perpetrators of workplace bullying do in our work environments is, they're trying to hook you, they're trying to get you to engage, and they're trying to get you to respond, because the response, how you respond, if you respond in a way that they think you're going to respond in a way, right, where you get defensive and those kinds of things, that's what they want. Okay, so sometimes silence and ignoring the behavior is a good technique. And I recommend that if you can, some of these like subtle, sarcastic remarks and the subtle criticisms and that kind of thing, the more you can ignore, the better I think it is. Okay. And again, just ignoring it isn't going to cut it, because you can still hear those things and they're still coming through. You're still comprehending those things. And so, again, at the same time that you're ignoring those things, you also have to protect your sense of self, right? So you have to develop strategies to kind of let that, bounce off, or do positive self talk and those kinds of things as those things are happening. Okay. So I'm gonna start with trying to use humor as a form or a way to deal with some of this stuff. Um, and again, sometimes humor is not a good technique, because sometimes we can interpret. Sometimes if we get a sarcastic remark and then we kind of say something humorous back, it's really just, it's basically sarcasm versus sarcasm, and it's not effective, because a good strategy is what you want to do when you're picking a strategy is you want to shut down the bully. That's your tactic. That's the goal, is you don't want them to keep going. You don't want to escalate it. Your tactic always should be trying to de-escalate and kind of, cut them off at the knees. Okay, but you can always leverage a little humor. Again, I think I'm funny. Okay, I'm not, but I think I'm funny. So I did use a little bit of humor occasionally to try to take the wind out of people's sails. Now, it wasn't always effective. I had a friend who was being bullied. She wasn't funny and never used humor, because it was just not, it just didn't come across right when she would say some of these things. Right? So if somebody says some sarcasm, you could maybe say something like, wow, that's a lot of sarcasm. Would you like a refill? Or just something like that. Again, you're sort of acknowledging what's happening in the sarcasm, but you're not really aiming it directly at that person. Um, so, or if somebody interrupts you, you might say, well, it really looks like you're really eager to talk. Let me go ahead and finish, and then you can go ahead, right? So you kind of get a little, lob a little bit of humor in there, but your point is already made that, they're clearly interrupting you, right? The other thing you can do is, you think silence and ignoring stuff is good up to a point, okay? But you can go to the extreme with silence and ignoring it. Because then when you're silent or you're ignoring it, then that really is kind of giving them the green light, the bully, to keep going on and on and on. So what I recommend is for, again, use your documentation, figure out when those times and when, what tactics the bully is using, so you can counter those. So if your bully is interrupting you a lot, then you can develop techniques to come in to deal with that, right? So the more you know about what the tactics the bully is using, the more informed your own tactics can be. Okay, that's why I'm a huge fan of documentation, not for reporting, but for your own self education to manage and develop techniques. Okay, because again, like, I really wasn't interrupted, but I know my colleague was 100% interrupted all the time. She couldn't get a word out in, right? And so even though we were in the same work environment, how we were treated were significantly different. She had overt, in your face yelling, nose to nose kind of stuff. I never had that, right? So how she dealt with those things is different than how I dealt with this more subtle behavior, right? So you could say, again, you might say something like this, right? If they're continuing to interrupt, again, remember, you always want to remain calm. You might say, whoa, hold on there, let me go ahead and finish, and then you can get your point across, right? But, something like that, where you're acknowledging that they are interrupting you. Now, here's one of the things that can happen is it might not work, right? And so then you have to, again, that's why your whoa comment, that's probably not going to be enough. What are you going to do if that comment doesn't work? You might want to figure out another way to do it. A good way also, I think, just across the board, just having in your toolkit of strategies that you can pull out are these neutral statements, right? So if somebody is making a sarcastic comment, like I think I've said this before, one of the things I say as a neutral comment all the time is, oh, interesting, right? So if we're ever working together and I say that, that's really just I'm confirming I'm hearing you. The statement's interesting, right? It just means I'm listening. That's basically it. But when you're saying, and so you should have a plethora of those neutral statements, like interesting, I see, that is okay, okay. I hear where you're coming from. Oh, and if somebody is trying to tell you what to do or trying to make decisions for you, right, you can always say things like this. I'll take that into consideration. That's something to think about. That's something to think about, right? So I'd have a ton of those things because you could go through an entire meeting and not say a word except say those neutral statements. And for fun, you could just try that, right? So I'd have a ton of those that you can just pull out, right? Because they're not engaging. If so, for example, if somebody is coming at me and telling me, I just can't believe that you're turning in your reports and your reports are crap, and why aren't you doing this and why aren't your reports like that, I can go, oh, okay, interesting. Well, that's I'll take those things that you said into consideration, right? Because what it essentially is saying, it's kind of cutting them off at the knees. I'm saying, okay, I'm going to think about what you said. I've heard what you said. I've thought about it, and I'll think about it. Right? There's less of a back. There's less chance the bully then will respond in another way because you basically sort of just de-escalated that situation, right? And so those are the kind of things and strategies that you want, right? The other thing I think you have to get to a point where you sort of call out that behavior in when it is happening. Because one of the things that happens, okay, is bullies do these behaviors all the time and they're just doing them and nobody is ever calling them out. And it isn't necessarily your job to call them out, but since nobody else is doing it, I think it's important sometimes that we, in fact, do call out sometimes that behavior. And here is an important thing I want you to really remember. How we call out the behavior is really important. Because, again, one of the things that's, bullies can bully us and bystanders can bully us, right? And they can engage in the normalized, unprofessional standards called bullying. But I can't reciprocate that, right? So we have these double standards in our workplaces where bullies and bystanders, supervisors and HR, they get to do the bullying and engage in that behavior. But if you're the recipient or the person being bullied, there's a double standard and you can't do it, right? And because once you do it, they're going to say, well, you see what? Jan was the troublemaker. She is a troublemaker. She's in here yelling at me, right? Okay. So just call it out in the most professional way. Okay. And so you might say, I'm a huge fan of this technique, which, lots of people call, I just refer to it as where you kind of give a stroke, a little jab, and then a stroke, right? Stroke and jab is basically what I call it. So you say, you bring up a very interesting point. I've noticed, though, throughout these meetings that one of the things you do, you're continuing to cut me off and interrupt, And, I think that's affecting the whole team and our ability to do our work. And I appreciate your, really your strong desire to want to talk and you're bringing up some good points, right? So you say you're bringing up some good points. You tell them that they're interrupting. You connect it to the whole group in the organization. It's not just about me. And then you say, okay, and again, another interesting point. So you say something nice, you jab, and you say something nice, right? So you're cushioning the jab, okay? And the reason it works so well is because people get caught up in the something nice you're saying that sometimes they don't realize that you've really jabbed them a good one, but they can't come really back because you've cushioned it in a nice, soft, couple minor and meager compliments, right? And again, I'm not saying you have to say, "Oh, you're a great person." I think you should just say things like, "Well, I think I appreciate your, wanting your desire to want to talk so much," right? Again, it's effective, okay? And the thing I would do ahead of time is, so sometimes it's very difficult when you're the one being bullied to try to come up with something nice to say about the abuser in your workplace. So again, go into ChatGPT and get a couple of nice neutral statements that could be considered compliments that when you want to jab, you can cushion those things. And I would do the same compliment at the beginning and at the end. Okay, right? So you're cushioning with it basically with the same compliment. They get caught up in that. Sometimes they don't really realize you've sort of knocked them off their feet. Okay. The other thing you can do is, which I made reference to it again, is when you're calling out that behavior. One of the things that we get caught up in oftentimes when as being the person who's being bullied is we have a tendency to say, you make it about us, right? So you're interrupting me and you're criticizing me and you're aiming these sarcastic remarks at me, and that's off-putting to me and it hurts my feelings or something like that. But when you connect it back to everybody in the group and you say, it's really, Bob, I really understand you have so many great things to say. However, you're interrupting me, which is taking me 10 or 15 minutes longer to say what I needed to say. And again, I really appreciate your willingness to talk, but it's affecting the entire team and we're not getting enough work done, right? So what you want to do is, again, it's important that they know, again, when you're calling them out, connect it back to the entire team, because then it doesn't look like it is affecting you, obviously, right? But we want to connect the bullying behavior back to the entire team, so therefore then they can't say, well, Jan has a problem with Bob, right? And I think it makes your point when it comes to if you decide to report and make a complaint about workplace bullying, it makes it more significant. Okay. The other thing I think is really important too is that um, is if you have a collaborative partner or somebody in your workplace that you can work together and develop strategies, this is really important. First off, you have to trust that person, okay? And then you can develop strategies and techniques together. So for example, if you're in a meeting, okay, pretend we're in a meeting and I'm the bully and I'm continuing to interrupt you and you're not getting your point across, your collaborative partner can distract the bully, me, away from you by just asking a question, right? And so then and maybe your collaborative partner has a good idea of what you want to say, and they might say something like this. Well, you know what? One of the things that I think that, Barb wanted to say was blah, 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 blah. And then she might, again, so then what she's doing in that situation is she's distracting me from you. She's continuing to highlight the points that you want to make, and then she can say something like this. And is that right? Right? So even though the bully might go back to you, right, for a few minutes, they have distracted that person. And also, they have then allowed that person to say what you might have wanted to say, right? So, a collaborative partner, again, if there's sarcastic remarks, they can divert the bully's attention away from you and onto them, okay? And nobody has to know the wiser, because if you're in a team meeting, right, and somebody in your team asks a question, that's everyday work. It does not seem unusual. You're not highlighting that person as your collaborative partner. It's just seemingly another team meeting where things are happening and people are asking questions, okay? That same person can do the same sorts of things if it's you and Bob the bully in the hallway. They can come up, say, hey, you know what, Jan, I have a question for you, and they can interrupt those things, right? So there's a lot of different strategies that your collaborative partner can work with you and distract the bully. They can interrupt. They can do all sorts of things that help you deal with the bully, right? And sometime in the near future, we'll talk more about, how do you identify a collaborative partner, and what's their purpose and those sorts of things. But I think when you're working with, subtle verbal behavior like criticism, interrupting, sarcasm, jokes, that kind of stuff, the best you can ignore that and be silent is great. But at some point, you have to respond to those things. And then I think you do that in a calm, professional way. You can use humor. You can use assertive questioning and question them back. Well, what did you mean? What do you mean? Can you be more specific about that? Right? And really call out their behavior. There's a lot of different techniques and strategies to use. Again, go back to your documentation and figure out what the bully is doing to you so that you can then develop and tailor your strategies to the type of bullying that you're experiencing. Okay? Because no two people who are being bullied exactly the same, right? Because it depends on the type of bully you have. How many people are in your organization? Who's jumping on the bandwagon with them? And do you have any support, right? There's a lot of different variables and factors involved in this bully culture, okay? So if you have, and again, I would love it if you would give me a follow and a like and all those things, and let me know if you use any of these techniques or strategies and if they work for you, and or even better, if what other strategies that do you use that we can share then with other people. Because I think the more strategies and the more ideas that you have when you're dealing with the workplace bully, the better it is for you, because then you have these strategies, kind of a Rolodex of strategies that you can use together, you can build on, and you can choose from if one doesn't work, right? And then that becomes a more effective and strategy to deal with workplace bullies, because they're coming at you with different techniques and tactics, and the more strategies you have, the better you can combat the abuse that they are perpetrating on you. So I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining me. I will be here again on Tuesday, and we'll talk about again on Tuesday. We'll talk about some issue related to workplace bullying, and on Thursday, we'll talk about a strategy or strategies to deal with that. So let me know if you like this format, or if you'd rather just have me kind of go back to the format, which was pretty random in the past. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.